You're listening to
Campus Killings,
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
and
Citizen Detective.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Hi, Megan, and welcome back, listeners. And welcome to our last case of Season 3. And this will be a two-parter. So this is part 1 of our Season 3 finale.
Which means the school year is over.
That's what it means.
Just about.
Yes. Congratulations to us and to all of you out there who either work or go to school.
Yep.
If you're in anything under college, you only have another month or so it's okay. Hang in there.
Yes.
All right, so this is not only an international case, but a historic one. We are going back in time to the terrifying regime of Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany in 1943.
Wow.
And it's hard to believe that universities were even operating during this dark time. But many German young people were still pursuing education when they could. And as we'll discuss, universities were also where dissenters were able to fly under the regime's radar, at least for a time. And dissenting is exactly what a group of University of Munich academics did between the summer of 1942 and the winter of 1943. Referring to themselves as the White Rose, they strove to bring about the end of the Nazi rule, really the only way they knew how, through their education and writings. And it would sadly prove to be a deadly task. Though the story hasn't been told much outside of Germany, there is a ton of excellent research material on the White Rose, and we'd like to give a shout out to the authors Annette Dumbach and Judd Newborn for their book Sophie's Soul and the White Rose, which provided most of the information for our two-part season finale. And since this is a historic case, I'd like to give a little background on Munich and Ludwig Maximilian University, which I'll refer to as LMU during this episode.
Okay.
So I'm going to give you background about this university during Nazi occupation, just so we understand what the White Rose was up against. So let's start with the city itself. While not the oldest city in Germany, Munich still has a long and rich history as the third largest city in the country. Located in southern Germany and considered the capital of Bavaria, Munich is a global center for science and technology with a multitude of scientific institutions, though I would say most people are attracted to the city for its beautiful architecture, sporting events, and friendly culture. And while Munich is known for its annual Oktoberfest celebration and historic beer halls, the city is also infamous for being the birthplace of the Nazi Party. In the 1920s, there were several political factions fighting for power in Bavaria, and one of these was headed by Adolf Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
In 1921, Hitler began holding meetings about his idea for a National Socialist Party out of Munich's most famous beer hall, the Hofbräuhaus.
Yeah, I've actually been there, Amy.
Did I pronounce it correctly?
It didn't sound correct, I'm not going to lie, but I don't remember the exact pronunciation either. And I'm sure someone's going to write and say one way or the other it was wrong. But I know the place because I traveled through Germany. And Munich is specifically where I went, and I've been to that location, and I loved Munich also, and I was only there for a short time, but I thought it was also really interesting to be in that place because, historical purposes, not just because I like Bavaria and all the beer and good food.
I'm headed there on a study abroad trip next month.
Are you guys doing Munich also?
I think so. I know we're doing Berlin, and I think Munich might be on there.
Yes. Okay. I knew you're doing Berlin as well, but I wasn't sure about Munich. But I can't wait to talk about it with you when you come back.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Okay, so these meetings would later lead to the rise of the Nazis, and by 1923, Hitler and his stormtroopers, as he called his followers, had enough power that they staged a coup to overthrow the Bavarian government. Though it failed at the time, it laid the groundwork for the Nazis to take control of Germany about a decade later. By 1933, Hitler declared Munich the capital of the movement, and the city held great significance for Hitler throughout the Third Reich's reign.
Mm-hmm.
For Munich civilians, this meant heavy Nazi police presence at all times, as well as most of the public buildings being turned into headquarters for the Third Reich's administration. But what Hitler was not prepared for was that several students and a professor from LMU were going to cause a shockwave. Now, as a rule, Hitler and his party despised universities and intellectualism. But professions like doctors and scientists were still needed in the Third Reich, so Munich's university was allowed to continue operating. Now, this university is the oldest one we've covered so far. It was established in 1472.
Oh my gosh, that is the oldest one because you said that once before. So I was going to say, wow.
No, 1472 is like, so needless to say, LMU is one of Germany's oldest, but also continuously operating universities. And prior to Nazi rule, LMU held great prominence in the European scientific community. Today, it's Germany's second largest university and boasts 44 Nobel laureates and several famous alumni, including Pope Benedict XVI, the German composer Richard Strauss, and American writer Joseph Campbell. But in 1933, when Hitler took control, most academic freedom was suspended and professors were forced to teach Nazi propaganda as part of their curriculum.
Right. Yeah.
The university's presiding rector, basically what we would call a university president, was an SS director appointed by Hitler. And several of the staff, and I'm talking not the professors, I mean like clerical staff and janitors, they were spies for Hitler's secret police. And while most of the students going to the university were not interested or absorbed in politics, it didn't necessarily mean that they were pro-Nazi. In fact, many were very much against the Third Reich, but it was very dangerous for anyone to even make a joke about the Nazi movement or Hitler, never mind outrightly resist or dissent.
Yeah.
In fact, those caught voicing dissent were seen as enemies of the state and would not only find themselves on trial for treason, but their families would also be imprisoned in what was known as Sippenhaft, or kin punishment. So clearly, any dissenters of Nazi politics had to be very careful and extremely secretive, and that meant organizing any kind of protest virtually impossible. But there was one group of students who were determined to make their dissent public and to bring down the Third Reich in the process, and they called themselves the White Rose.
Amy, do you know why they were called the White Rose? I'm just not familiar with this.
I'm not positive, but I would bet it has to do with the fact that the white rose is a symbol of purity, innocence, and resistance in the face of evil. So that kind of makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
While they grew to have many members, we'll be focusing on the founders and their later fates at the hands of the Nazi criminal justice system. So let's go ahead and meet some of the main players. In the summer of 1942, 21-year-old Sophie Scholl took a train from her hometown of Ulm to meet her brother Hans at LMU. He was already enrolled in the university's prestigious medical program, and after 2 years of patiently waiting, Sophie would be joining him for a degree in biology and philosophy. And she was beyond excited, and not just because she was embarking on her college career. You see, the Third Reich did not encourage women to pursue education. But her grades in high school had been so good that she'd been selected for the university as one of only a handful of women from her town. But get this, she was not allowed to go right away because everyone in the Reich had to perform 6 months of hard labor for the war effort.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And Sophie had actually spent a whole year in service to the Reich, first serving as a kindergarten teacher for children of factory workers, and then another 6 months in a factory herself, where she worked 16 hours a day and was lodged in unheated barracks with hundreds of other young women. These are almost like the untold stories of this time. Because in all my education and reading, I never knew about this whole process that women had to go through.
No, yeah.
And while Sophie had become a silent dissenter of the Third Reich in her early teens, her half a year working for Hitler's war machine had made her hatred for the Nazis grow tenfold. She saw her admission to LMU as a welcome escape from the oppressive world that she had been living in. And of course, she was also excited to see her brother Hans, as when the semesters were over, he was often sent off to war hospitals to work as a medic, so she didn't really get to see him that much. Hans had a little apartment off campus in Munich's art district where she would be staying while she pursued her studies. But what she didn't know at the time was that her brother was working on a secret and very dangerous plan, a way to disrupt Nazi power in Munich.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Amy, what else can you tell me about Hans? I feel like he just kind of came out of nowhere, and I don't know. Like, what's his story?
Okay, so Hans was 3 years older than Sophie, And he had become disillusioned by Nazi propaganda as a teenager and actually began performing small acts of defiance even before he entered the university. Though he joined the Hitler Youth in 1933 at 14 years old, after attending a Nazi rally in 1935, he saw firsthand how terrifying the fanaticism was, and he was disgusted by it. His disillusionment was also encouraged by his parents, who were deeply religious Lutherans and very much against Germany's turn to National Socialism. And as several of the family's Jewish friends were taken away, and the Reich started banning everything from the works of Aristotle to American movies and even jazz music, he knew he had to do something to dissent. So in 1937, he quit the Hitler Youth and joined a prohibited boys group that had not been approved by the Reich. Hans also identified as bisexual, which was illegal in the Reich. And by 1937, he was put on trial for what was considered, quote, criminal homosexual behavior. And this was after one of his boyfriends turned him into the Gestapo. And it's unclear if he was set up or not. So I'm not sure, the circumstances around this.
Could have also been coercion and fear or just threats.
Because he was young and he made a good impression on the judge, Hans got off with a clean record, and this further ignited him to defy Nazi rules. Some ascribe this to Hans' youth. He felt invincible and untouchable since he'd gotten away with something that most people would have been sent to concentration camps for. And this emboldened him to defy the Nazis more drastically. By 1939, he had completed his mandatory hard labor for the Reich, and that's when he then enrolled in LMU's medical program. And at LMU, many of Hans' professors spoke out against the Nazis in the privacy of their own classrooms. And Hans came across other like-minded students who'd become disillusioned about the Third Reich during their mandatory time in the Hitler Youth groups.
Can you tell the audience and me a little bit more about these youth groups?
Yeah, what I can tell you is that all children aged 10 and up were mandated by the regime to be enrolled in the Hitler Youth programs, and all other children's groups were abolished. So, they just had no choice. They were forced into this.
So basically every segment of society, children, teenagers, they're forced into some form of servitude, study of the Nazis.
Yep. And, luckily there were people like Hans. And Hans met two students in particular, Alexander Schmorell and Trata Lafrenzi. Now, these two students made quite an impression on Hans, and they encouraged him to figure out a way to more deeply resist the Nazi regime. So now let me tell you a little bit about Alex and Trauta. Alex was a Russian who emigrated to Germany as a child, and he brought with him a love for Russia that became extremely problematic when Hitler declared war on Russia, and Alex was forced to fight on the German side against his own countrymen. Side note, military service was compulsory for all young men in Germany at this time. So even though Alex and Hans were going to school, they were still sent to war zones to fight or work as medics in between semesters.
Right.
And though it meant execution, Alex deeply considered deserting his post on several occasions, although he never quite went through with it. Between the Nazi invasion of his home country and how much Hitler's National Socialism deviated from his beliefs as a Russian Orthodox Christian, Alex was looking for some way to defy the police state in which he found himself. But he was a quiet, thoughtful, and artistic soul who lacked the drive to start any kind of real resistance. However, his friend Trauta could not have been more different. She met Alex in 1939 while he was at the University of Hamburg, and you could say she was quite his opposite. While Alex's parents were learned intellectuals who quietly hated Nazi rule and kept a library of banned books for their children to access, Trauta's family eventually joined the Nazi Party and did not speak of politics in their home. Despite this, though, she became disillusioned by the propaganda and fanaticism after one of her favorite teachers was fired and barred from teaching for her anti-Nazi rhetoric. In retaliation of the regime, Trauta publicly handed out copies of a banned letter by German essayist and Nazi dissenter Thomas Mann in 1937. In 1941, she moved to Munich to study medicine with Alex at LMU, and he introduced her to his new friend, Hans Scholl. Between the summer and fall of 1941, while Trauta stayed in Munich, Hans and Alex were shipped to the front lines to care for wounded German soldiers. After seeing the horrors of the Jewish ghettos and the Nazis' barbaric treatment of the conquered Polish and Russian civilians, they decided that it was time to act. When Hans and Alex returned to Munich in the winter of 1942, they and Trauta gathered two other like-minded friends from the university that they felt that they could trust. Christoph Probst, a young father of three who was also a medical student with Hans, and Willy Groff, a friend of Christoph, who was a staunch Catholic and anti-Nazi who had been arrested in 1937 for failing to join the Hitler Youth.
Mm-hmm.
All intellectuals and incredibly well-read, the 5 students decided to write a series of leaflets that condemned the Third Reich and called for protest.
These are incredibly, this is really dangerous.
And they were well aware of the potential consequences. Or should I say the likely consequences.
Right, yeah.
Utilizing quotes and academic arguments from famous German writers and poets, they wove an argument denouncing Nazi rule that also incorporated texts from the now banned Aristotle and the Christian Bible. They titled them Leaflets of the White Rose, a name that Hans took from a Spanish novel that he loved.
So White Rose also, there's double meaning.
There is double meaning
to it, yeah.
Their hope was to appeal to their fellow intellectuals to start a chain reaction that would help Germans who quietly hated the Nazis to stand up and protest. With a borrowed typewriter and a hand-cranked printing press, the students secretly spent their nights in a hidden back room of a bookshop, hand-cranking out hundreds of copies of their leaflets.
Wow.
And they really covered all their bases because they were even secretive about getting the supplies like the paper and the ink. They would often go out of town to buy these items so that it wasn't traceable to them. So they thought of it all.
Yeah.
Between June and July of 1942, they wrote 4 different leaflets that they deposited in secret places around campus by tucking them into library books and slipping them into telephone books in phone booths. They folded other copies into envelopes and mailed them to random addresses that they found in the phone book. In addition, they sent targeted leaflets to students and faculty of the university. Trauda also secreted a briefcase full of leaflets up to Hamburg, where she distributed them in hidden places around universities. And I just want to reiterate that as much as we might think that printing leaflets is a small drop in a big ocean, these students were literally risking their lives to do this.
Right.
If anyone found out what they were printing, they would have been arrested for treason against the Reich and punished by execution.
Mm-hmm.
And several of the leaflets were turned into the Gestapo, so they had to be extremely careful that no one, not even their family members, knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
But unfortunately for Hans, in the fall of 1942, his sister Sophie found one of the leaflets under a desk in a classroom. And after reading it, she recognized her brother's writing style.
Oh.
And if he was putting
interesting.
And if he was putting his life on the line for something he believed in, then she wanted to share in his work.
Wow.
And though he didn't want his little sister involved in such a dangerous affair, he relented, and the White Rose now gained another member.
So now what are they at, like 5 or 6?
That's
about
the 6th
members, something
member.
like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
The students could not have picked a better time to distribute their first 4 leaflets. Around the same time that they peppered Munich with their anti-Nazi rhetoric, the German city of Cologne was heavily bombed by British and American fighter planes. And this was a huge blow to the German people, especially when Hitler's government sent no aid to the people of Cologne. Many started questioning the true nature of the Third Reich, and though there is no historical evidence to prove that the White Rose leaflets had any real effect, many more of LMU students were caught whispering angry words about the Nazis after the leaflets appeared. And the Gestapo were furious, and they sent a group of secret police to investigate where the leaflets were coming from. However, because the White Rose was so careful about where they were buying their paper and ink, and they were literally taking letters on the train and dropping them in random mailboxes in other towns, there was no real way for the Gestapo to pinpoint who was responsible.
Well, unless somebody leaked at some point or, there's always a mistake, especially when there's so many people and they're being careful.
Yeah, but this small success wasn't enough for Hans Scholl. He wanted more people to be involved with the resistance. The more members who could get printing supplies and help secretly distribute the leaflets, the further their message could travel. But it was difficult to find trustworthy dissenters who were not acting as Gestapo spies. So the core members put out feelers around the university, and they found a kindred spirit in one of their professors, Dr. Kurt Huber. Now, Dr. Huber was a professor of psychology and music at LMU, and though he towed the party line to keep his job, he did make subtle commentary denouncing the Nazis in his lectures. While the average student might have missed these barbs against the regime, members of the White Rose did not. And so they carefully invited the professor to a meeting and asked if he would edit their newest leaflet.
Wow.
Yeah. And they wanted to reach a broader audience. And as a psychology professor, they felt that Dr. Huber would be able to make their intellectual arguments more palatable to the average citizen. A long-standing dissenter of Nazi politics, Kurt Huber was impressed with the White Rose, And though he had philosophical issues with much of their draft for the fifth leaflet, he agreed to help them, and he edited their essay into an easy-to-understand argument against the Nazis. But while they now had an appealing leaflet, just hiding it around Munich and a few universities in Hamburg was not enough. They wanted more widespread distribution. Hans, in particular, wanted the White Rose to get involved in a bigger resistance movement so that their leaflet could go nationwide. And he heard of a group in the capital city of Berlin called the Red Orchestra. Now, this group was made up of hundreds of men and women who had resistance cells set up all over Europe, including those in occupied France, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. And though Hans only learned of its existence because the Gestapo had uncovered their plot to assassinate Hitler, and most of the members had been tortured and executed, Alex had a contact for one of the survivors who was rebuilding the resistance under a new name. Through the mentorship of this contact, Hans and Alex were able to start setting up their own resistance cells at other universities to distribute the White Rose leaflets. And over the next few weeks, members of the White Rose took turns hand-duplicating over 10,000 copies of their fifth leaflet in a secret back room of a Munich bookshop. Entitled An Appeal to All Germans, the leaflet explained how Hitler was never going to win the war, and the readers were encouraged to resist National Socialism and the way it dehumanized so many people. The White Rose further called for Germans to support, quote, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and protection of the individual citizen. Throughout the month of January in 1943, 5 of the students boarded trains with suitcases filled with leaflets and hand-delivered them to contacts all over Germany.
This is really incredible. And I've never heard this before, by the way. This is not part of any history class I've taken.
No, it should be. Wait till you hear how this ends up. Thousands of copies of An Appeal to All Germans turned up in 9 different cities and made enough of an impact that Hitler's personal administration learned of the White Rose's existence. Orders were sent out to all of the city's Gestapo headquarters to squash the authors of these leaflets immediately. What the Gestapo didn't know was that the White Rose members were ferrying the leaflets right under their noses. On the trains, which were heavily policed by the SS Nazi guards, the students would hide their suitcases in a different car than the one that they were sitting in, so when the guards came through to check their tickets and luggage, the leaflets would not be connected to them if they had been discovered.
That's smart, because I imagine, too, when they learned of the existence, that they were going to order searches. So that's a good tactic.
And then once the train was emptying, the students used the mass of people exiting to cover their movements when they retrieved the suitcase. The students would then either meet up with their personal contact and hand off the suitcase, or they would find the nearest mailbox and dump prepackaged leaflets into the mail hundreds of miles away from their intended destination. And then they would simply get back on the train and go back to school. It was simple and effective, but their far-reaching message was making the venture increasingly dangerous, and the Nazis were investigating. LMU was becoming a hotbed that further brought the school under the Gestapo's eye. On January 13th, 1943, a student riot broke out at LMU during a Nazi ceremony on the campus. In one of the speeches, a Nazi official denounced the students and faculty of LMU, citing that they were, quote, twisted intellectuals with, quote, falsely clever minds. He then went on to insult all the female students, claiming that they were taking valuable space away from men and that the university was simply giving them a place to, quote, shirk their war duties, and that they needed to return home to bear children for the Reich. Now, he went so far as saying that women should be, quote, providing Hitler with a child every year, and that if they felt that they couldn't find a man to sleep with, he would be happy to set them up with one of his junior officers. But the female students erupted at this. They began throwing things at the Nazis from the balcony of the lecture hall, and several were aggressively arrested by Nazi police. Then the arrest of the females caused the male students to attack the officers. So fistfights broke out throughout the hall, and a Nazi guard was even taken prisoner by the students and held as ransom for the arrested women.
Oh, wow.
The Gestapo was called in to break up the riot, and though it lasted less than an hour, students were fired up afterwards, and the Gestapo began to take a hard look at LMU. Had the riot started because of some female students' hurt feelings? Or were the leaflets that kept appearing inciting a change in students' opinion on the Reich? By the time the White Rose's fifth leaflet hit far-reaching cities, the Gestapo were already on the hunt for the authors in Munich. But this didn't deter the White Rose. Whether they suspected the Gestapo was onto them or not is actually unclear, but They took the riot as a sign that these leaflets were working.
Mm-hmm.
They pumped out another 1,500 copies of a call to all Germans, and this time, instead of hiding them, they left them in obvious places like park benches, movie theater seats, and apartment building lobbies.
Wow.
In fact, Alec, Hans, and Willy Graf took it a step further and painted anti-Nazi graffiti all over the exterior walls of the university.
So they're going from secretive and to more emboldened. I mean, they want to get their message out there now, but sadly, I think that's also going to be how they might be discovered.
And only one member of the White Rose seemed to see how dangerous things were getting. Christopher Propst warned Hans and Willy that they were getting reckless. And if they blew the White Rose's cover, it would mean death and destruction for not just them, but their families as well.
Right.
But the men were too excited to slow down, especially as the German army surrendered to Russia at the Battle of Stalingrad in late January.
Okay.
They saw this as a true sign that Hitler's demise was imminent, and if they could get the German people to turn against him, then the Reich would collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And they were onto something, as the Gestapo paperwork from this time noted that Munich citizens were becoming hostile towards the Nazi government, including slapping anyone in the face who gave the official Nazi greeting of Hail Hitler and heckling anyone wearing the Nazi party insignia on their lapel. The White Rose needed to keep up the momentum. So Dr. Huber, Hans, and Alex got to work immediately writing their 6th leaflet.
Wow.
This, titled Fellow Students, it honored the young German soldiers who had been killed in Russia as part of Hitler's war machine and urged the people of Germany to rise up and protest. By February 17th, the leaflet was edited, typed, and over 1,000 copies were ready for distribution.
That is some network that they are, like the distribution that they managed is really impressive.
Yep, I would have to agree. Again, these are young adults here.
Yeah.
On the morning of February 18th, around 10 a.m., Hans and Sophie left their apartment with a large suitcase and they headed for LMU. They passed the, quote, "Down with Hitler" graffiti that Hans, Willy, and Alex had painted over most of the building's exterior walls, and they entered a glass-enclosed courtyard of the campus's main building. Classes were in session until 11:15, so the campus was quiet at this time and everyone was in their classrooms. That is except for Traute and Willy, who were walking through on their way to a medical lab, and they saw Hans and Sophie with the suitcase. And Traute would later recall knowing that the siblings were going to do something risky. And she wasn't wrong. Once their friends had gone, Hans and Sophie opened the suitcase and began tossing leaflets on windowsills and in front of the closed classroom doors before walking up to the top of a long staircase that led to the second floor and emptied the remainder of the suitcase over the railing. But, unbeknownst to the siblings, they were not alone in the hall. A janitor, who was a staunch Nazi supporter, saw the shoals and immediately screamed that they were under arrest for distributing anti-Nazi propaganda. His voice echoed through the halls just as students were leaving for their classes. And though Hans and Sophie tried to fade into the crowds as they left the building, the janitor caught them.
Oh, wow.
The university rector was called, and as I said in the beginning, he was an SS officer and appointed by Hitler, so the Scholls knew immediately that this was the end of the line for them.
Right. Ugh.
As the Gestapo secret police arrived, Hans and Sophie gave each other a silent look to remind each other that no matter what happened to them in the hands of the police, they would not give up anyone else in the White Rose. And that's where we're going to end today. So a bit of a cliffhanger. Sorry.
I knew you were going to do that, just so you know. I knew that was going to happen. Okay, but I did know, and you did say that this is a two-parter.
But please join us next time for part 2, where we will learn the fate of the White Rose members and their impact on the Nazi resistance. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you on the next episode, part 2 of the White Rose Resistance. Before we go today, if you'd like to support Campus Killings, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts.
Your subscription will get you VIP access to all the shows on the network that not only includes hundreds of episodes of ad-free listening, but also bonus content and early access to episodes.
For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting this show in the process.
Head over to Apple Podcasts and search for either Campus Killings or AbJack, and you can start your subscription with a free trial.
Your support is greatly appreciated.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook at facebook.com/campuskillings. You can also visit the show's homepage at campuskillings.com. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.